So with tokens defined as teaching tools, we talk about a few of the pro-social ways that they can be used. Storytelling will be where we focus most of today's conversation, but the syllabus also goes into two other ideas that are related about how tokens can be used to improve discoverability on the internet, which currently struggles with the current models, including Google searches not being as good as Reddit searches, not being as good as asking your friends. So how might that work? And a related issue of moderation. And ultimately, meaningful stories is what we sense could be a big part of the Web3 story. So the first thing that then comes up when talking about stories is the complementary opposite of telling a story, which is listening. And we go back to the beginning of the syllabus, which is where Paul Myberg, who has been a big inspiration for the syllabus, is quoted by saying, "The quality of listening informs the quality of speaking, always." He also says, "Good listeners do not listen to respond, they listen as a response." And this characteristic of listening as the backdrop for healthy storytelling is something that we wonder about as it relates to token communities, and also just the applications that we might build towards a healthier internet, which is what type of applications could we build that encourage us to listen better? When we think about information environments, Kia Kreutler just put out a tweet that said, now her Twitter feed is going back downhill because, more than ever, you're seeing tweets for people that you don't follow. You're seeing tweets of things that that might be suggestions, but not things that are a part of your own interest. And so for our information environments to encourage listening, like what does that look like, and how healthy could that be? And it's a big part of the next module, which is incentives. So the main idea here is that incentives require a persuasiveness, and a persuasiveness comes from an embodied experience. And in this case, in this module, it's written as words which perform what they say. So if somebody talks to you about an idea but does not resonate, often there's a sense that maybe those words don't mean as much to them as they say. And this is a big part of incentives, is exploring how we can create environments that do what they say that they'll do. And I think exploring this with Andy could be really healthy. So without further ado, I want to start to describe a few things Andy has done outside of Kernel. Prior to Kernel, he's written quite a few books, all in access on that website link, andytudhope.africa, and a series called The Blue Book that now has 5 different parts that set out with some interesting ideas and pull together resources in kind of a novel way that I had never seen before. A lot of the resources in the Blue Book allow for an internet native exploration of what it is that approaches the question of like, what does it mean to love? But does so in ways that allow you as a on a web page to play around in ways that you might not be able to do with a physical book. So there's some work there. to maybe explore mechanism design. He worked on a project called DApps, which was one of these incentive layers focused on discoverability, discovering DApps in Ethereum. He's been working on the learning curve for kernel, which perhaps would come up, although maybe signature economies comes before then. And just by background, English, studied at Oxford for his master's, and has a background in physics and math before that. And it's quite well read in a lot of other things. And I think that it really is a blessing that he's been with us for kernel and has allowed for kernel to become what it is. Since the beginning, it's been quite literally a gift that he gave with the syllabus, which was, as a friend of mine, first and foremost, trying to answer my questions about what this whole Web3 thing is about. So it's always very meaningful to be able to spend time. And I hope, Andy, I haven't embarrassed you too much. And you might be able to start us off with anything that touches you from what was being described about listening, stories, and incentives. And if I can, as usual, ask two disparate questions to you at once. What is this picture that you use as your profile picture all about?
Wonderful. Well, my voice is coming to you from the void, so that seems appropriate for today. Please forgive any choppiness. Blame it on a place called Cathedral Peak in the Drakensberg, which means Dragon Mountains, which is where I am. And I begin there because I think it has something to do with, in particular, the listening and stories piece, which really grounds a lot of what is then put forward in incentives. And there is a direct analogy that can be drawn between the people who listen to a story and peers who validate the state of a network. In some very deep sense, the place where I come from is imbued with various different kinds of people for whom telling stories has not just been about communal gathering and holistic relationship, slow and intentional ways of being in the world, although it was also all of those things, but what are called the keepers of the kum in South Africa, these first people whose cave paintings I am currently kind of surrounded by. The kum were considered not just communal narratives, but in fact the narrative machinery of the universe. And one had to sit around the fireside and tell the stories each night of why Orion chases the seven sisters across the sky and never quite seems to catch them, and how it is that the moon waxes and wanes and what its relationship with the sun is, and all of these things, because not only did they reflect a reverence and respect for the world of which we are a part, they, through the conscious telling of them, kept the universe turning. They kept life flowing, these kum, these stories. And in some very real way, that just takes modern form in the nature and manner in which we choose to validate shared states. The ways in which we do so are more disembodied and abstract, but the primary resonance and feeling of it can still be realized and lived through a particular kind of attention to listening. And what is it to really listen? And where does that come from? You've got a beautiful image on the screen here of Paul Myberg, who is a man that spent 7 years living with the Gwikwe, some of the last people to live truly the nomadic lives in the Kalahari. And he talks about many beautiful things in that episode, which was shot by a friend of mine at Rhodes when I was there at university. She did her final year documentary on Paul Myburgh, and it won the Audience in Stunned Silence Award at their final showing, which was an award that they made up on the spot because they aired the documentary and there was just dead silence in the auditorium for at least a minute afterwards. People were just in a different state. And it's that kind of silence which is so rich and gives us a deeper insight into the kinds of stories that we ought to listen to and think more carefully about validating, think more carefully about incentivizing. You know, so much of the behavioral incentives in our culture move us toward different kinds of consumption, different kinds of action. And while to live is in some sense to consume, and there are very, very deep things to look at in terms of responsibility and accountability. And while life does have something to do with action, the root of action is this deep and shared silence, right? And that brings us back to like, what does it mean to listen, right? What does it really, really mean deeply to listen, other than to hear yourself reflected in the words of a seemingly other person? That this is in some real way the greatest kind of listening you can cultivate, to hear the perspective and opinions of others that you yourself could never have come to or imagined, but to hear it in a way that is no different to your own heartbeat. And this is kind of what Paul Myburgh is talking about. And it is also in some way, seeing as you asked me about this, reflected in the photo that you have on the screen now, right? This wonderful notion of reading your own book. The image itself comes from a great Sufi friend of mine and is closely associated with a very particular line from the Quran. And I won't butcher it in Arabic, but it comes from a chapter called The Pen. And it says, "In the name of your Lord, read." So literally the story is that Muhammad goes up the mountain and has been doing a vigil, a night vigil, for some time. And Gabriel, which is really just a metaphor for pure consciousness, descends and tells him, read. And Muhammad quite famously responds, "I can't. I don't know how." And this has been interpreted to mean that Muhammad was illiterate, which is one of the sort of readings or interpretations of this passage that you will find common and very involved in the various trade routes around Mecca. And what he's saying here is not that he is illiterate, it's that he can't read what he is being asked to. So Gabriel tells him again, read. He says, no, really, I can't. And finally, one last time, Gabriel says, read. And Muhammad agrees. He says, okay, I will try. And what is really being spoken of in the story, which is not really entirely unique to Islam, I think you'll find it across many of the Abrahamic stories, and indeed in many of the Eastern religions as well, similar story forms, similar exist. And it's really to read the divine tablets on your own heart, which is like fancy words to illustrate that you really have to just know who you are and live that as authentically as you can. And in that, listening deeply to the world as it reflects who you really are, we can come to both tell better stories and understand how to shape incentives in such a way that it can craft the kinds of behavior that will lead us to more purposeful and meaningful ways of living, both individually and collectively.
Mm-hmm. It's good to have you from the void, my friends. Thank you for sharing. And the stories that you've kicked us off with, I think, give a sense of the depth from which this particular module comes, much beyond any Web3 stories, but also quite related in this new context. And I think there's different parts of this module that I could put on the screen that talk about epsilon theory and the ways that our narratives are shaping our lives. And there's all sorts of conversations around memetics and their importance. We obviously have Sal here, who maybe can talk more about that in the chat than I could. But the importance of memetics and stories drives towards maybe taking this to the Web3 level for a moment. And I like that this module is called Tokens and Mechanism Design, and that over the last 2 blocks, we've started to explore not tokens as much in kernel, but signatures. And of course, these are 2 related things, but to do my Gitcoin grants donations today to KB5, and shout out to John Ruth, and if you want to put the KB5 collection in the chat, I encourage everyone to support the KB5 projects, the 36 that are in the collection. But when I went to do my ZK Sync transaction, there was some movements of tokens, and then there were some signatures that MetaMask required of me. And these 2 things are slightly different mechanisms, and signatures, as you describe, seem to point us more towards these internal songs of signs, and seem to be underrepresented as we talk about how things can move through Web3. So as we talk about incentivizing listening and richer stories, I'm curious if we might weave in a bit of thought around tokens and a bit of thought around signatures, and how both of those might play roles in incentivizing a culture and software that allows for deep listening.
Well, yes, you're right that they're deeply interrelated. The reason why focusing on signatures first is interesting is because when we think about, speak about, and describe tokens, even in the way that we have defined it in the kernel syllabus, you'll see that it is deeply objectified, right? Like a token is a thing, it's an object, it's something which proves one's ability to enter a space or reveals allegiance to some kind of guild or other club. It is a fact. It is the minimum meaningful information transferred in computer networks between different nodes. All of these are objects. And that's wonderful to understand, right? There's very, very important and necessary practical and pragmatic aspects to be looked into and comprehended, right? Like you can see any number of these guides out there on token engineering and mechanism design will lead you into thinking, and some have been shared in kernel just in block 5. And I mean, across all of the blocks, you will see a wealth of resources around, what does the emission schedule of this token look like, and what is the total market cap, and is it good to have an inflationary versus a deflationary currency, and should we follow Hayek and von Mises, or should we think more like Keynes, or do we recognize that Keynes works on the assumptions of Smith, who borrowed a whole bunch of his thinking from Al-Ghazali? You can go into it endlessly and understand really almost infinite amounts of practical detail, which are all wonderful and necessary. And are the focus of like many of the guilds where we talk about these like practical things, right? But what I'm pointing at here, and the reason that using signatures is a way to go a step deeper, is that it's not just about the object. It's not just about the market cap and the circulating supply and whether the token is valued correctly and what kind of liquidity it has and if there are secondary markets. Like it's not just about that. Those are all good, superficial and practical questions to ask, but the movement of any kind of knowledge is always from the superficial into the depths, which are always archetypal, right? Not about me, impersonal, and then back to what Kafka calls the now doubly illuminated surface, right? So we don't deny the practical objective nature of things like tokens and the way that they can be used to transmit certain kinds of information or to teach very practical and pragmatic things, or indeed to invent new and more holistic kinds of economies. But in order to really truly understand why those things matter and how we might think about not just total value locked, but total value allocated, in the case of Panvala, or total value used to advance the cause of women in rural Africa, as the Grassroots Project does. In order to think more creatively about these kinds of superficial practical aspects of projects and employ them in really pointed, purposeful ways, we need to go into these archetypal depths. And that's where signatures are, right? Because signatures are not just objects. Your signature tune, your signature dish, your signature shot, it's something which is uniquely you. It exists singularly, right? Like there is a singularity to your signature. When I make that particular mark on a check or on a contract, it is a very, very particular moment in time in which I inscribe some kind of essence into the world. And yet, your signature in all its singularity has to also be iterable, right? You have to make the same signature over and over again for it to be meaningful. Right? It has to check against all of your previous marks. And this complementarity between singularity and iterability is a wonderful one, which leads us away from the object, which is a token or which is a coin or which is some kind of thing that we can acquire and hold. And even if it's a digital abstraction, we enter into this materialistic, acquisitive mindset around it. And the signature, it moves us back into something more like an internal state, right? Like, what am I truly expressing in this moment as I put my pen to paper, as I click this button in MetaMask? What is it really? What am I exuding? What aspects of myself is being enacted, is being signed into existence? And all too often, it is once again that more material and acquisitive part of our nature. And I think that when we can begin to open up the conversation about, look, what does ownership really mean? Undoubtedly, this thing about ownership has resonated with a lot of people, and the ability to own your own data, to receive due recognition for the work that you do, to distribute value in more meaningful and holistic ways between communities of creators. All of this stuff is wonderful and clearly resonant with a great number of people, not just cypherpunks. But the question is, what does ownership actually mean? Because typically speaking, it means control and possession, right? Ownership comes from this Roman law concept of res. It means the ability to do what you want, to destroy, right? In actual fact, Roman law premises the concept of possession or ownership on the ability to destroy your land. And we see that enacted in the modern world in so many different ways. And so here we have to think much more carefully about, look, what does ownership actually mean? Because, when I have a token, I don't don't own anything in the traditional sense, right? There's nothing that I can put between my teeth to bite and test the validity of. All that it signifies, right, is a mapping in a contract whose storage is wrapped up into the shared network state. And that mapping simply takes a balance, some unsigned integer, and maps it to my address, giving me the permission to change that mapping should I wish to transfer the tokens, right? That's what you really have in some sense. And so it's not about control or possession. It's really about the ability to make meaning. Right? And this is what we've been saying over and over again since module 1, right? Like meaning and value. This is all about our ability to make meaning. And that's almost ineffable to really talk about. This is why we have to move into deep metaphors and into saying that, it's a new order of language, this econo-linguistic thing that we have, which is not just a new kind of language like JavaScript or Italian or Esperanto, but a new order, because all of a sudden the kinds of meaning that we can make by these signatures, by enacting our essence with intention, awareness, humility, and deep receptivity to the environments in which we participate, that is, as I say, almost ineffable, because what kinds of meaning can you make? It's anything, And we've seen a great deal of rather uncreative applications of that, because the thought that the world is really open for play, that it really is just all conventional, is an enormous and confronting one. It's really funny. My partner showed me this really hilarious video, I think, for the Avalanche hackathon recently, where they begin, and it's this wonderful B film of a big wave curling and somebody surfing it, and hugely inspirational music. And it's the classic line, I'm sure you've heard it all before, right? It's, did you know that the world was made by people no smarter than you are? And, off it goes into the rest of the stuff about their hackathon. And she's just sitting there hosing herself, saying, oh my God, where are all the intelligent people? I was kind of hoping that the people who set this up were more intelligent than me, because I'm an idiot. And I think there's something really deeply funny in that, right? And it points at why this particular thought is quite confronting, that all of a sudden, all of your appeals to authority, all of the innate hope we have that somebody is coming to save us, that there will be a beacon of light who appears and happy, fulfilled, and wholesome life. There's something in us, in all of us, that longs for that, and is inevitably disappointed when we find that no one can ever play that role totally. And what is being offered here, what signatures point at, is your own responsibility, but also your own ability, right? Just your own ability to enact your essence, to enact your meaning in the world. And there's no greater gift that you can give or receive, because it's simultaneous, right? To know who you really are and to live that is at once the most immensely liberating gift any human being can ever receive, and simultaneously the greatest gift that you can ever offer to the world.
Fits beautifully with what Christina just posted in the chat, which is a word, lila, which is loosely translated as divine play, common to both the non-dualist and the dualist philosophical schools of Indian philosophy. That also reminds of what you described as signatures, both singular and iterable, the ways that we find the balance between the internal world and the external world. It's it's all back to those complementary opposites that we use as the patterns for the beginning of the syllabus to set us up for all sorts of questions and conversations, because it's not that what Andy just described is an answer, but it really just brings us back to a question for ourselves in every moment, which is, are we living in a way that both of those complementary opposites are being respected and fulfilled in a way that we can enjoy? Reminds of the freedom module, which describes freedom not as this like ability to run around doing whatever you want, but an understanding and a respect for your constraints. And for me personally, that's been such a beautiful part of the syllabus that I've been able to weave into my own life. And I have Andy to thank for that idea that has kind of made its way into my mind. And there's something about the environment for me of the kernel website that has given me a lot of structure as, you know, crypto Twitter moves at a very high pace, as the world seems to be spinning faster and faster, that I have a spot for myself that can be kind of like a quiet container for my own thoughts as things continue to shift. And I hope for others on this call, it can be a similar space, not because there's any particular idea in there that's sacred, although we draw from many different spiritual traditions, and we have Andy to thank for a lot of that. But because it can be a container for a bit of quiet and a bit of a different pace, and it embodies that in a way that allows for exploration, hopefully. And so, you know, the incentives we hope on the site are one that embody this listening characteristic for yourself. And for me, I've definitely felt that when I'm in the syllabus, it reminds me of other also slow places on the internet that allow me to listen a bit more to where I actually am, and if I'm paying attention enough to the question that's being posed by this picture. Am I paying attention to my own book? So you spoke a lot there. You didn't explicitly get to incentivizing listening. And I wonder if I had one more question before opening it up, and I think that there will be questions. Incentivizing listening, these ideas around like discoverability and moderation, the hope for quieter places on the internet that we might be able to instantiate if we can respect silence as a part of internet culture and custom, and create places that encourage listening. What does it look like? Is there anything you'd like to say just about incentivized listening? If you'd like to take it into some of these ideas from Amazon on unbounded search or discoverability and moderation, we could go there. And then from there, really open to questions and other voices.
Wonderful. Yeah. I want to there's a particular quote from an incredible lady called Nancy Schneidler, which speaks to the piece that you shared about freedom and constraints, and gets me into one last thing, which I would like to discuss here. She says, and once those limits are understood, to understand that limitations no longer exist, Earth could be fair, and you and I must be free, not to save the world in a glorious crusade, not to kill ourselves with a nameless gnawing pain, but to practice with all the skill of our being the art of making possible. Now, this is a really beautiful invitation. And I can think of no greater incentive not to save the world in a glorious crusade, not to kill ourselves with a nameless gnawing pain, but to practice with all the skill of our being the art of making possible. You see, if you click on the final link in the incentives piece, which we discussed a little last night in the Juntos, you will find a talk by a man called Anthony Asler, who is a Zen teacher in the Karoo in South Africa. And at the very end of that talk, after discussing a koan, which is a Zen teaching mechanism, he discusses another koan, which is about why did Bodhidharma go to China? And a monk comes and asks the master, he says, why did Bodhidharma go to China? What was his purpose? And the master says, no, he had no purpose. No purpose. And the monk says, oh, if he had no purpose, why did he go? And the master has to say, no, it's not that he hadn't any purpose either. You've approached me in this way, which is about the mind. First, oh, he must have had a purpose. And then I've had to negate that. And so the mind naturally falls into its opposite, which is no purpose. And that's meaningless. And so it rebels and says, well, why did he go then? And it's about neither of these things. About neither of these things. He didn't go because he had a purpose, but nor did he not have a purpose. And he ends the talk. It's truly something else. It says, and the mind rails and rails and rails against this. What is the meaning? What is the answer to this? How do we understand what it was that drove Bodhidharma east to China? And he says, then our whole body begins to listen. Our whole body opens and we're just listening. And the light is hitting the floor and the windmill creaks. It's a wonderful moment. And for me, it captures something of this Nancy Schneibner quote, right? It's the art of making possible. That truly, there is another talk in the index page for Module 5 where we discussed at length some of the more specific and practical technicalities of discoverability and moderation as they apply to the history of these tools from Walmart through Amazon into common knowledge and the missionary and game theory as discussed by Ben Hunt and epsilon theory and all of the stuff that we can learn from computer game designers and Jonathan and Mark, as well as Daniel Cook in the final piece on pro-social value. So there are, there's a great deal of content there on a practical level, but here, like in some very real way, how do you incentivize listening? Well, again, there's like many levels that one can think about this at. Some people have put forward very interesting ideas about how slow many things on the blockchain are and how that is a feature, not a bug. 10 minutes to confirm a signature on the Bitcoin blockchain, 16 seconds on Ethereum, 13 seconds maybe these days. And that's actually wonderful. It's an opportunity. We've talked about how these technologies can help us to experience time in a different way because it is literally a distributed network of timestamp servers. That's Satoshi against the authoritarian political regimes within which most of us live. And that does move us closer towards something like Kairos and further away from Chronos. And all of those things are wonderful, and we can think about them in many different dimensions. And I think that there are wonderful people, including many who've been through kernel, on Timeless and many others. But at a deeper level, what incentive can one give to discover who you really are? What is the combination of words which will convince you that it is worth going on that journey, that it is worth truly listening to whatever is taking place around you, the porters in the hall outside, the aircon, the luggage rolling into this place where I'm staying. All of it is a part of the total moment as it unfolds, right? And there is a means of being deeply intimate with that, which is not readily available in words, but which has something to do with what Christina posted, Lila, this play, particularly the Advaita perspective, the non-dualistic perspective, right? Because what is being pointed at by Anthony when he says, okay, it's not purpose and it's not no purpose, or Nancy when she says, once the limits are understood, to realize that there are no limits, that it is all convention, and that we have not to save others or feel deep pain and suffering, but to practice with all the skill of our being, the art of making possible. I mean, that's such a beautiful non-dual perspective in this context, right? It's not about how you can incentivize others to listen. It's not about how you can make slow spaces for other people online. All of these are worthwhile projects to come back into. But first and foremost, you read your own book and how are you online each and every day in each and every moment? And that sounds like a ridiculous and impossible ask, right? But there's a quote from Tom Robbins. He says, of course it's unthinkable, of course. But in order to do the impossible, it is precisely the unthinkable that must be thought. And this is true for each and every one of us, right? First, how am I when I am online? Am I intentional? Appear on my screen on a daily basis? Am I available for them? Am I present with them? Do I understand my own boundaries? Do I respect them and show them courtesy? Do I exude the kind of simplicity and awareness and presence which I so long to see in the environments in which I participate? And if that's true, then already the world is changed. And one finds oneself in China delighted because it's not about purpose or no purpose. The clouds have cleared from the valley and the birds have found their way home. And there is this natural loveliness in everything. And that is so much more than enough.
Yeah. One of the reasons for kernel being a thing, the way I see it, is that I just wanted to spend more time with Andy. He's been a good friend and a great friend and one of my best friends. And that's only grown through kernel. And I feel very grateful for what was just shared. The only last thing I'll share as it relates, there's only one, that's not true, not only one, but there is a new part of the kernel module 5 that moves from listening into silence, which is described as a commons by Ivan Illich, who comes up for the first time in the last module. And there's a lot to be said, but since we're talking about silence, I'll leave it more or less in the chat, and I'll open it up for a discussion from there. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you. I also share this feeling that it was really just about spending more time with you and the lovely people who seem to flock to your caramel voice. I'm endlessly grateful.
Okay. Thank you, Annika, Rachel, Jocelyn, Anastasia, Galactic. Agreed. If anyone would like to unmute, continue the discussion in any direction, we would be more than grateful.
Charles here, greetings from Zurich. Just a quick comment. I've done a lot of deep dive. I mean, thank you, by the way, Andy and Vivek and everyone. number one. Number two, I did a lot of deep diving into listening, well, for my whole life, but really in terms of the central importance of it. I just wanted to tag a couple of things on there, which is responsiveness and reciprocity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charles. You have tagged a great deal onto the syllabus over the last 2 years since you joined us, and we are just incredibly much of how you have conducted yourself over the time has been exemplary of and performs the notion of reciprocity. And for anybody who is interested to see, there's quite a detailed git commit history behind the kernel websites, and you will find many of Charles's contributions there. Indeed, one from something mentioned last week in the Infinite Game, in the gaming track. If you go into the build section and the gaming track, the final piece there on value, on Infinite Games, has a wonderful, wonderful piece about a jazz musician who we greatly loved, and Charles has connected us with. So these little gems, Charles, that you have left in the syllabus, we are just really, really, really so grateful for them. Ornette Coleman is his name, if you're wondering, and along with Sun Ra and many of the other characters you have introduced to us, we are delighted, entertained, and deeply grateful.
Much love.
Question from Tegan in the chat. How do you practice reflection?
How do you?
Ask you first.
I'll say briefly that there are a lot of mirrors in this room who help a lot with that process.
I think that's one of the things that Charles just said is also largely indicative of this, right? This notion of like reciprocity is a wonderful way of thinking about that. That I don't think you can necessarily, beyond my kind of joking initial response, like practice reflection. But what one can do is recognize that the quality, intention, and direction of the people that you surround yourself with is largely determinative of the quality, direction, and intention of your own life. We are social beings. We resonate with the limbic states of those around us, and we tend to behave in ways that are consonant with the groups in which we participate. And so simply being aware that everybody is reflecting all of the time. Tegan, you yourself know very well that this world is Leela, a play of another way of describing it, the whole of mirrors, right? You're only ever looking at yourself in all these different shapes and forms. And keeping that in remembrance and being clear about the kinds of image you wish to look at, learn from, imitate, and have reflected back to you is probably the most simple directive I have ever come across. Just be deeply aware of how we affect and are affected by every person around us. And to the greatest extent of your capacity, find others with whom you resonate and love them. It's that Vincent van Gogh thing, it's just, it doesn't matter what you do as long as you do it with love, with real deep love. And then Because obviously we can't totally curate the people that we're around, our family, and these kinds of things are given, right? And so while we can be conscious of the effect that people have on us and around us, to some extent we're not in control of that either. And so the only ground that leaves you with, having gone through all of it, is just this deeply loving response, which is what Van Gogh talked about, but again, many other people. So, including Rumi. If you ever want to know more about love, just ask Rumi.
I want to potentially pass the mic to Sophie, if she'd like, for her question. As I could ask that, and then we have Marlon and John.
Hi, thank you everyone. Yeah, my question is like, what do you recommend when you find yourself being pulled in multiple directions? Does this help me come closer to understanding myself, or is it the opposite?
That's a beautiful question. Again, in this talk by Anthony that is linked in the incentives module and that Vivek has kindly put in the chat here, he speaks about the final two spokes of the wheel, the eightfold noble path. And these two spokes in English are right meditation, right mindfulness, and right samadhi, which really means like meditation or focus. And right mindfulness is breath. It's this intimate presence with everything, no matter what it is, and that is inherently multiple, right? There's so much going on around us all of the time. All of us are pulled constantly in 84 trillion different directions, right? That's the number of cells in the human body, each one of which is acted upon by forces you can scarcely begin to imagine, from the cosmic to the subatomic. Particular level of reality, we are all pulled apart all of the time and reconstituted, pulled apart and reconstituted. Being mindful is the ability to be broadly, deeply, and intimately aware with all of these multiple things happening all of the time. And then samadhi, right? Like right meditation, right focus. And so in being mindful of everything that is happening all of the time and not giving in, right, to one's anxiety or stress, noticing it. There's no problem with stress or anxiety. All of us feel it. No problem there. But the ability to notice it right, so that you can keep flowing, is a wonderful thing to have, which is developed by the seventh spoke, mindfulness. And that allows you to then put that single pointed direct focus onto the particular aspect of the moments, which has to do with this art of the possible, which has to do with the most artistic expression of what is possible in every moment, which again is infinity, right? Like anything is possible at any given moment. But the chances of it coming to being are different, and they have to do with our ability to place our focus in a particular point. These two things do not contradict one another, right? They complement one another. And in the Buddhist path, they come in a particular order. It's mindfulness first, then samadhi. But it's not like a linear thing. This is why it's always depicted as a wheel, right? Because like once one has become aware that there is this mindfulness to be cultivated and refined, then you can also become aware that there are ways of within the mindful states being like single pointed and direct. And then one moves back into the very first part of the wheel, and that's actually discussed in the final module in a similar way. If you go to module 7, you'll find a very, very beautiful passage about prana. So I hope that's the sort of wide overview. It's, how one develops mindfulness and samadhi is largely dependent on where your own heart leads you. You know, as I've said before, for some it's meditation, sitting quietly doing nothing. For others, it's ecstatic dance. For others, it's cooking and cleaning the dishes. For others, it's conversation. For some of us, it's walking in nature. There's no set path. There's as many paths as there are human beings. But I think just to be aware of this is already such a wonderful beginning, and you can feel pulled in 84 trillion directions and not let it bother you all that much. It becomes Leela, it becomes this beautiful play. And feeling those 84 trillion pulls becomes a great joy, because you're pulled into and out of yourself. You know, it's not anything different.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Sophie. Marlon, if you'd like.
Hello. Hello, everybody. Thank you. Thank you, Andy. And yes, so I just want to probably add a layer that, you know, it's relation to the inquiry in relationship to silence and listening, but actually the part of silence. And so I just would like to add a layer of the kind of socio-political understanding of expression and silence. So, you know, I'm from a generation in which silence was death. And I also have lived 5 years in a retreat meditation center, Vipassana. So, and so then I really would like to put a cautionary point in kind of prescribing silence or prescribing some kind of action that can be taken as passivity, so, or not responsive with the right action, because that is also a very interesting proposition of the Eightfold Path. You know, so then there is the right action that is speak up. And to complement our right of existing and presence and the right of aspiring. So yeah, I just really wanted to add that, because I've been many times, mostly when you are a minority, your expression can be evaluated as a lack of equanimity, and then the same, it can be gaslighting. You know, the same prescription of some kind of universal behavior of goodness can be used to put you against the wall. So then, you know, I think that all these concepts needs to be very examined very deeply, because also they mostly come from a history of Buddhism in the West that normally is very, very related with whiteness and privilege. So anyway, so I just want to add a social, cultural, political turn, that when we're using spiritual terms, we normally are doing a lot of interesting and many problematic aspects in relationship to, yeah, so it becomes a doctrine. So a doctrine that comes from New Age, from California ideology, from a lot of things. So then, you know, I just really feel that it's not the same to prescribe Buddhism that prescribe voodoo. So, but they're both very, very important religious practices. So, but they have colonial and relationships with some views of taste. And the other is that when we only select the people that we like, we tend to tribalism. That's the other part, that we actually have, of course, limbic resonance with a lot of people, but we normally tend to resonate with the people that we like. And the people that we like come from the people that we are, you know, probably biased towards them. Anyway, so just it's a very complex subject. So, and I just want to put out there, because it creates a very strange paradox, the prescribing silence. Yeah, so.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Marlon. I really appreciate that contribution, and you're absolutely right. I couldn't agree more. Right action is certainly a part of it, and silence, as in passivity or as in some kind of doctrinal prescription or dogmatic way of living, is not at all what we ought to be incentivizing or thinking about in any kind of mechanism or description or shared way of being. It reminds me of something that Douglas Rushkoff was talking about, right? Which is that the impulse that we're all kind of looking for is to be eccentric, right? Like it's that's how we find the others when we're weird and wonderful and outside of the prescribed expectations of our culture and our conditioning and our society. And yet, as you so beautifully put, as soon as somebody is weird or eccentric, capitalistic colonial culture contrives to turn that weirdness and eccentricity into just another consumable product or religious doctrine that can then be used to oppress minority voices, right? And so one constantly has to remember that it's not about the content of the weirdness, the exact makeup of the eccentricity. It's about the connection that it allows you to make with others, this ability to find the others, and find those others in as hopefully a diverse and different place as one can, far away, from the conditioning of your own, like body, background, upbringing, and language. And I'm constantly kind of reflecting on that, that it's not about any particular thing. There's right action again comes immediately right after right samadhi, right? They're one next to the other and constantly moves, and so that contribution is perfect and well timed because as soon as this is mistaken as some kind of static description or doctrine, then inevitably it falls into the very sorts of paradoxes that it's meant to illuminate. And when instead it's taken as this invitation, alive, dynamic, always living, then there is the space and the room in it required for, infinitely weird kind of behavior. That word weird is such a wonderful one, isn't it? Because it comes from virt, that means destiny. When we are weird, we are truly with our destiny. And, I don't want to describe what that is because, again, it runs the danger of being doctrinal. But I think that there's something really beautiful in knowing that it's this dynamic thing of finding others and continually finding yourself, finding that beautiful light, which is just by virtue of being truly who you are, finding that beautiful light over and over and over again in every other that enters your life, no matter how different they appear, different languages, perspectives, orientations, beliefs, whatever.
Thank you, Andy. I think we have one more from John, and then maybe one more, either Tegan or Sister Tibetbo. There's some things we can explore. John, please go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Just double checking. So I think really what struck me is this idea of being a space for possibility, and it just reminded me of this sort of emerging ethos or maybe identity of solar punk, for a person to declare that they're a solar punk, and really the idea behind that being envisioning a world where we have fixed the world. We've created, this, maybe it's overused, but utopia, whatever that means to each of us. And I guess I wanted to just add this sort of invitation for everyone to just stand in the possibility, to stand in the possibility that we can heal the planet, to stand in the possibility of peace, to stand in the possibility of your own power and your own love. And there's just so much power in truly just standing in that possibility and really like deeply envisioning and seeing all the color, all the taste, all the sounds of this world that's possible, because then it can become a reality. And but I really appreciate you, Andy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. That was so beautiful.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I sense that perhaps going to Sister Tebebwa and maybe back to Tegan's questions are two places we can go. If anyone else would like to share anything, please feel free to unmute. Sister, anything?
Greetings of love and light and peace and darkness. Once again, I'm studying the Hermetic principles, the ancient Kemetic principles, the ancient African principles of polarity. Anytime like it seems that polar opposites are at the end of at two sides at the end of a line, when in fact they're more like in a circle. So when you dive far down into speech, you'll get to silence. When you dive far down into silence, you'll get to speech. And that somehow when we step out of one into the other, so if we step out of the center point, or I think it's not a point, it's more like a wave between, and step into speech, there's times when speech is what's necessary. For instance, if there's injustice taking place, we must speak. And there's times when it would seem that silence is the best way, but actually staying silent is deeply not the right thing to do. And when and so it's somehow to rest in the center and know when to flow into one polarity and when to flow into the other, but rest in the middle way. So yes, that's what I wanted to say. I also wanted to say I wanted to offer a junto for the full moon, which is tomorrow night, if anyone wants to join. Peace and love and joy.
Yeah. I'll put that junto in the chat. Sister has done this before and it was beautiful. Thank you for offering it again. Wonderful. Andy, any thoughts there? We also could go to one last question. I like, Sister, the people you have at your party over there and the tree in the back.
Sister says it so beautifully. I have nothing to add on that front. Thank you.
Well, great. The question that Tegan asked that seems like we've gotten there is a very broad and open-ended one. And we don't have to go too much longer. We only have 10 minutes left. We also have some outro music to play, but the question very simply is, can we talk about prayer? And Andy, I wonder if there's anything you'd like to say there. I'm happy to play some music on the way out as well.
It's a very open-ended question, yes. I think that's, in this context, the critical thing to be said about prayer is that it is the active embodiment of humility. That it is, the way that it is described in the syllabus later on is that it helps to develop an internal language of need. And one can begin to understand truly what you need and the fact that you are in need. And knowing that, you can begin to understand what generosity really is. And knowing what generosity really is brings you into a deeper remembrance of and awareness of grace and mercy and these kinds of attributes. So many people have different ways of praying, and I think that's wonderful. And to echo what Marlon was saying earlier, this is not about some doctrinal or dogmatic way in which one is raised above another. It's simply to indicate that this is a powerful means by which you can come to terms with the natural loveliness of your own needs and how that leads you deeper into the world. It leads you deeper into hearing the only voice you can hear and saving the only life you can save. And that for me is wonderful.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, sister. Thank you, Tegan, Marlon, Anastasia, Sophie. So many people in the chat. Rachel, Aaliyah, Mambui, Hanifa. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We'll play some outro music. I'm not going to put the link to Gather today because I think there's been a lot. If you want to stay to enjoy some sonics, and then we wish you a really, really wonderful rest of your day. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for trying the video off thing and hopefully still enjoying some quiet space in your day. Enjoy. All right. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day. Much love. Bye-bye.